What was the hardest part of being a girl in your family? Dad grabbed a weighted backpack, strapped it onto my shoulders, and made me walk around the house for 3 hours because I'd grown taller than my brother Paul, and he needed to compress my spine back down. This had been going on my whole life. Dad came from this community where men being taller than women wasn't just preferred, it was literally required. He kept photo albums of all the women in his family standing next to their brothers with rulers measuring the height difference, and he'd show them to us like they were trophies. His own mother had broken her legs on purpose when she started getting taller than his uncle, and Dad talked about it like she was a hero. Mom was 5'2" and Dad was 6'1", which he said was the reason their marriage worked. My older sister Georgette was 5'4", and Paul was 5'7", so they were fine. But I was 5'8" at 13 and still growing, and Dad acted like I was personally trying to destroy the family. Every Sunday, Dad would line us up and measure everyone. Mom had to stand there too, even though she'd stopped growing decades ago, because Dad said the ritual kept everyone humble. He'd write our heights in this ledger, and if any of the girls had grown, he'd lose his mind. Around the time I turned 13, Mom started showing up to measurements looking sick and exhausted, and one morning I realized she was pregnant. I spent the next few months praying harder than I'd ever prayed for anything that it would be a girl. Another girl meant I'd still be the tallest daughter, meant I wouldn't have to shrink myself down for another brother. I'd catch Mom rubbing her belly, and I'd think, please let it be a girl. The morning I measured 5'9" and Paul was still 5'7", Dad didn't even speak to me. He just went to the garage and came back with the weighted backpack and said, "Put this on." When I asked for how long, he said, "Until your bones learn their place." Mom tried to say something, but Dad shot her this look and she went completely silent. Georgette was watching from the hallway with this look on her face like, "I'm so sorry this is happening to you too." The backpack was absolutely brutal. Dad made me wear it for hours every day, even when my back felt like it was breaking and I literally couldn't stand up straight anymore. He replaced my mattress with a wooden board because he said soft surfaces let your spine expand at night. Every morning he'd measure me, and if I was even slightly taller, he'd add more weight, or make me do these horrible stretches where I hung from the door frame, while he literally pulled down on my legs. I started slouching constantly, trying to look shorter, and my back hurt so bad I could barely focus on anything else. Meanwhile, Paul got to do whatever he wanted. Dad was feeding him protein shakes and making him do exercises to grow taller, and Paul would walk past me struggling with the backpack and go, "Maybe, if you weren't such a freak, Dad wouldn't have to fix you." Mom would try to help me sometimes by lying about my measurements, but Dad always checked himself and he'd lose his mind at her for interfering. Her belly kept getting bigger and bigger, and I'd stare at it during measurements thinking that baby better be a girl or I'm completely screwed. Then I grew another inch and hit 5'10". Dad absolutely lost it. He said the compression wasn't working fast enough, so he was taking me to see someone who could stop my growth for good. We drove 2 hours to this doctor who worked out of his house and had bone diagrams covering the walls. The guy measured my legs and took x-rays and told Dad he could surgically remove parts of my growth plates, so I'd stop getting taller. Dad's face just lit up and he scheduled the surgery for 2 weeks later without asking me a single thing. I was completely freaking out, but Dad just goes, "You should have thought about this before you decided to keep growing." He showed me photos of Georgette's legs from when she'd had the same surgery at 14, and you could see all these scars and how she walked with a limp now. Dad goes, "Your sister understood what sacrifice means, and now it's your turn." I couldn't let him do this to me. The night before the surgery, I waited until everyone was asleep and climbed out my window. I made it about 6 blocks before Dad's truck pulled up next to me. He didn't say anything, just grabbed me and threw me in the back. When we got home, he dragged me straight to the basement and locked the door. I heard him putting extra locks on from the outside and then his footsteps going back upstairs. I was down there for 3 days with just a bucket and some water bottles. No food, no light except what came through this tiny window. I kept thinking about the surgery and how there was no way out now and how I was going to end up exactly like Georgette. Then on the 3rd day, the door opened and Mom came down. She was crying and she had this tiny baby wrapped in a blanket. She could barely look at me when she said, "You have a new brother." My heart just dropped straight through the floor. Another brother. Another boy I'd have to stay shorter than for the rest of my life. I started crying because I knew Dad was going to make the surgery even worse now. Make sure I stayed small enough for 2 brothers instead of 1. But then I heard Dad's footsteps coming down the stairs and he was smiling in this way that made my blood turn to ice. He looked at me and then at the baby and said, "His name is Charlie and the doctors say he has dwarfism. He'll never grow past 4 feet tall." Dad kept standing there in the doorway with that frozen smile on his face, and I could see him doing the math in his head about how Charlie's 4-foot maximum meant I needed to be way shorter than I'd thought. He turned around and walked back upstairs without saying another word to me, and Mom followed him with the baby still crying in her arms. I heard the locks clicking back into place from the outside, and then their footsteps fading away, and I sat there in the dark basement knowing the surgery was going to be even worse now. Because Dad had a brother who would never grow, and that meant I had to shrink down enough to make the difference visible. The surgery was still scheduled for 4 days from now, and I had no way out. That evening, Dad finally unlocked the basement door and told me to come upstairs for a family meeting, and when I climbed up, my legs were shaking so bad I could barely walk. He made everyone sit in the living room with Charlie in Mom's lap, and Georgette and Paul sat on the couch while I stood by the doorway because Dad hadn't told me I could sit. Dad started talking about how God works in mysterious ways, and how Charlie's dwarfism was actually a test of our family's commitment to proper order. He said that having a brother who would never grow past 4 feet meant the rest of us needed to take our responsibilities even more seriously. And he looked right at me when he said I would need to be compressed down to at least 5'6", so there would be visible difference between me and Charlie when he reached his adult height. Georgette's face went completely white, and she shot me this look of absolute horror from across the room, and I knew she was thinking about her own surgery and how Dad was about to do the same thing to me. Paul just nodded along like Dad was making perfect sense, and Mom stared down at Charlie without looking at anyone. Dad said the surgery was still happening in 4 days, and now it was even more important because our family structure depended on maintaining proper proportions, and he dismissed everyone except me. He made me stand there while he measured me again, and wrote down 5'10" in his ledger, and he said by this time next month I'd be at least 2 inches shorter, and we'd keep going until I reached the target height. The next morning, I woke up on the wooden board that was my bed, and every part of my back was screaming in pain from 3 days in the basement. Mom was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, and she had Charlie strapped to her chest in one of those baby carriers. And when I tried to catch her eye to ask if she was okay, she just stared down at the floor like she wasn't even inside her own body anymore. She was moving around making breakfast, but her movements were all jerky and wrong, and I realized she probably hadn't slept more than an hour or two, between Charlie crying all night and Dad's demands. I tried to say something to her, but she just shook her head slightly and kept staring at the floor, and I knew she was too exhausted and too beaten down to help me even if she wanted to. Dad came into the kitchen and told Mom she needed to keep better control over Charlie's crying because it was disturbing the household, and she just nodded and said she was sorry. That afternoon, while Dad was at work, Georgette found me in the hallway outside my room, and she grabbed my arm and pulled me into the bathroom where we could talk without anyone hearing. She whispered that I needed to do exactly what Dad said for now because fighting him directly only made the punishments worse, and I started to argue, but she cut me off. She pulled up her pant leg and showed me the fresh keloid scars around her surgical sites, and they were these raised, angry red lines that looked like they'd never healed right, even though it had been 3 years. She told me she'd been in constant pain ever since the surgery, and her leg still didn't work properly, and Dad called it her sacrifice for family honor whenever she complained. She said the scars got infected twice, and she had to hide it from doctors because Dad said medical people would try to interfere, and she showed me how her gait was permanently altered because they'd cut into her growth plates wrong. I felt sick looking at those scars and thinking about how Dad was going to do the same thing to me in 4 days. Later that same day, Paul cornered me by the bathroom and told me that now I had 2 brothers to stay shorter than, so maybe I should have thought about that before I kept growing like a freak. He had one of Dad's protein shakes in his hand, and he was doing these weird stretching exercises against the wall, and he seemed genuinely excited about having another brother to measure himself against even if Charlie would never actually grow. He said Dad told him that proper family order meant he needed to keep growing taller while I got compressed down, and he was proud to be part of maintaining the structure. I wanted to punch him, but I knew that would just make everything worse, so I pushed past him and went to my room. By the end of the first week after Charlie was born, my back spasms had gotten so bad that I started secretly timing them like contractions, and I realized the weighted backpack was doing actual permanent damage to my spine. I'd get these shooting pains that would lock up my whole back for 30 or 40 seconds, and then they'd release and I'd be able to move again until the next one hit. I caught myself hunching forward even when the backpack was off, and my body was trying to protect itself by making the slouch automatic, so I wouldn't have to consciously hold the position. Dad noticed me slouching one morning and said it proved the compression was working, and he added more weight to the backpack as a reward. That same week, Dad reinstated the doorframe routine where he made me hang from the frame while he literally pulled down on my legs, and the pain that shot through my hips and spine was so intense that everything went black for a few seconds. When I came to, I was lying on the floor, and Dad was standing over me saying that pain was just my bones learning their proper place. And he told me he was adding 5 more minutes to tomorrow's session because I'd passed out instead of pushing through it. I could barely stand up and my vision was still spotty, but he made me get up and finish the routine anyway. At the school the next week, I started wearing Paul's extra large hoodies to hide how much I was slouching, and one of my teachers gave me this concerned look during class when she noticed I could barely sit up straight in my chair. She didn't say anything, but she watched me more carefully after that, and I wondered if she was seeing what I'd been trying to hide from everyone. I kept my head down and avoided making eye contact with anyone, and I counted down the days until the surgery that I knew was going to ruin my body, the same way it ruined Georgette's. On Thursday, Carmen Rogers, the school counselor, stopped me in the hallway and casually mentioned that her office was always open if I needed someone to talk to about anything. She said it in this light way that didn't feel pushy or demanding, but there was something in her eyes that made me think she already suspected something was wrong. She handed me a pass to her office and told me I could come by any time during lunch or study hall, and she smiled at me before walking away. I ended up going to Carmen's office at the end of that same week because the pain in my back had gotten so bad I couldn't think about anything else. And when she asked how I was doing, I tried to minimize everything by saying I just had back pain from growing too fast. She noticed how stiff I was when I sat down in the chair across from her desk, and how I winced every time I shifted positions, and she wrote something in her notes before telling me I could come back anytime I needed to talk. I left her office feeling like maybe someone had finally noticed what was happening to me, but I also felt terrified about what Dad would do if he found out I'd talked to anyone at the school. That weekend, Dad called me into the living room and told me he'd scheduled another appointment with Dominic for the next week to finalize everything. He spread Georgette's x-rays across the coffee table like he was showing off vacation photos and pointed to the spots where they'd cut into her growth plates. The images showed these white lines where the bones had been stopped from growing, and Dad traced his finger along them, saying, "This is what proper correction looks like." I stared at the x-rays and felt sick because I could see exactly where they'd damaged her legs on purpose, and Dad was acting like it was something to celebrate. He told me the procedure would be even more precise for me now that Charlie's diagnosis meant the family structure needed careful management. I didn't say anything because my throat felt too tight to speak. Dad rolled up the x-rays and said we'd discuss the details at the consultation, but I should prepare myself mentally for the commitment required. The next morning, I found more of Georgette's photos on the kitchen counter where Dad had left them out. These weren't the x-rays, but actual pictures of her legs after surgery, and the scars looked worse than I remembered. The keloids were raised and angry red even though the surgery had been 3 years ago. Some of the scars looked infected with dark edges and puckered skin. There were notes in Dad's handwriting on the backs of the photos about how Georgette needed to push through the pain without complaining to doctors who might ask too many questions. One note said she was being dramatic about the healing process and needed to remember the sacrifice was for the family's honor. I put the photos back exactly where I found them and went to my room feeling like I was going to throw up. Mom caught me alone that afternoon while Dad was at work. She came into my room crying and holding Charlie against her chest. She begged me not to try running away again because last time Dad had put extra locks on everything and started watching my every move. She said if I just cooperated until the surgery was over, then maybe things would calm down. But we both knew that wasn't true because Dad's control only got tighter over time. Mom kept crying and saying she was sorry, but she couldn't protect me from this. I wanted to scream at her for being so weak, but I also felt bad because she looked completely beaten down. That night I decided running wouldn't work, but maybe documenting everything would. I still had my old phone that Dad didn't know about hidden in a box under my bed. I waited until everyone was asleep, and then I took photos of the weighted backpack hanging in my closet. I photographed the wooden board that had replaced my mattress and the door frame setup where Dad made me hang. I took pictures of the strap marks on my shoulders and the bruises along my spine. I uploaded everything to a cloud storage account using the school's Wi-Fi the next day. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was doing something real instead of just surviving. The consultation with Dominic happened on Thursday afternoon. Dad drove me 2 hours to this house that had been converted into a clinic. The waiting room had bone diagrams covering the walls and medical equipment that looked old. Dominic examined my legs while talking casually about disabling my growth plates so I'd stop getting taller. He explained the procedure like he was describing how to fix a car. He said he'd make incisions here and remove portions of the growth plates, and then close everything up. The whole time I was thinking about how this man had done this same thing to Georgette and ruined her ability to walk normally. Dad was nodding along and asking questions about recovery time and how soon I'd stop growing. While Dominic was talking to Dad in another room, I noticed his diplomas on the wall looked weird. The frames were nice, but the certificates themselves looked off. I used my hidden phone to snap photos of everything, including the bone charts and the paperwork on his desk. The diplomas were from schools I'd never heard of, and some of them looked like they were just printed certificates you could make on a computer. I realized this man might not even be a real doctor. Back at the school the following week, Carmen asked to see me during lunch. I went to her office and we were talking about my back pain when my hoodie slid down. Carmen's whole expression changed when she saw the deep strap marks on my shoulders. She asked me directly if someone was hurting me at home. I froze up because I didn't know if telling the truth would make things better or so much worse. Carmen waited for me to answer, and I could see she already knew something was wrong. That night, Dad gathered the whole family in the living room and drilled us on what to say if anyone asked questions. He made us practice our stories over and over. I was supposed to say I was just clumsy. Georgette was supposed to say her limp was from a sports injury. Mom was supposed to say everything was fine at home. Dad warned us that if anyone broke ranks, the whole family would suffer consequences. He hid the weighted backpack and the height ledger in the garage where visitors wouldn't see them. 2 days later, I was standing in the kitchen making breakfast when my back went into a spasm so severe that I collapsed. I couldn't get up off the floor and the pain was shooting through my spine like electricity. Mom panicked and called 911 before Dad could stop her. I heard her on the phone saying my daughter can't move and we need help. The paramedics arrived within 10 minutes and asked what happened. I could see Dad standing in the doorway with this look that told me I better stick to the story we'd practiced. At the emergency room, a doctor named Deepika Chin examined my back. She found the strap marks and the bruising along my spine. She pressed on my vertebrae and asked how long I'd been in pain. She took photos and wrote detailed notes. She told the nurse something about a pattern that's consistent with non-accidental trauma. I realized she knew someone had done this to me on purpose. Dr. Chin ordered x-rays and asked me to describe what happened, but I was too scared to tell her the truth with Dad sitting right there in the room. 4 days after the hospital visit, a woman named Alyssa Nguyen knocked on our front door and said she was from CPS doing a scheduled home visit. I felt this tiny spark of hope mixed with complete terror because I knew Dad had been preparing for this moment since Dr. Chin made her report. Alyssa had dark hair pulled back in a bun, and she carried a tablet and wore this expression that was professional, but not unkind. She asked to speak with each of us separately, and I could hear Dad's voice in my head from the night before when he drilled us on our stories and warned that breaking ranks would bring consequences for the whole family. Dad smiled at Alyssa and said of course she could talk to anyone she needed to, and he acted like we were the most normal family in the world. The house looked completely different from it had a week ago because Dad spent 2 full days sanitizing everything and hiding anything that might raise questions. The weighted backpack was gone from the corner where it usually sat. The door frame in the hallway had been cleaned and the pull-down rig was dismantled and hidden somewhere I didn't know about. My room looked normal with a regular mattress on the bed instead of the wooden board. Dad even put up some family photos in the living room that made us look happy and close. When Alyssa interviewed Mom privately in the kitchen, I stood in the hallway and heard my mother saying that everything was fine at home and that I just had normal growing pains like any teenager. Mom's voice sounded flat and exhausted, but she stuck to the script Dad had given her. Alyssa took notes on her tablet and walked around looking at different rooms, but she didn't find the backpack or the ledger because Dad was too smart to leave them where a caseworker might look. She checked my room and asked me some questions about school and my back pain, and I gave her the answers Dad had made me practice. I wanted to tell her the truth so badly, but I kept thinking about what would happen to Georgette and Paul and baby Charlie if I broke ranks right now. Alyssa left after about an hour and said she'd follow up in a few weeks, and that felt like nothing was actually going to change. Dad watched her car pull away, and then turned to all of us with this look of satisfaction, like he'd just won something important. That night, after everyone went to sleep, I waited until I heard Dad snoring, and then I crept downstairs to the garage. My heart was beating so hard I thought someone might hear it, but I made it to the garage door without waking anyone up. I found the weighted backpack shoved behind some paint cans, and I pulled out my old phone that Dad didn't know I still had. The strap marks on the backpack matched the ones on my shoulders perfectly, and I took photos from multiple angles showing how worn the straps were from me wearing it so many hours every day. Then I found the height ledger on a shelf behind some tools, and I photographed every single page going back years and years. The measurements showed exactly when each of us had grown and what Dad had done about it. There were notes in his handwriting about compression routines and how many hours I needed to wear the backpack and when he'd added more weight. Some pages had measurements for Georgette from before her surgery, with notes about the procedure and recovery. I uploaded everything to the cloud storage account I'd set up using the school Wi-Fi, and I labeled each file with dates and descriptions, so someone looking at them would understand what they were seeing. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was building something that existed outside this house and outside Dad's control. I put everything back exactly where I'd found it and snuck back upstairs before anyone woke up. The next morning before school, Georgette caught me in the hallway and slipped me a manila folder without saying anything at first. Inside were copies of her surgical paperwork from when she was 14, including papers with implant lot numbers and post-operative instructions that mentioned complications she'd had. There were photos of her legs right after the surgery showing the incisions and swelling and notes from Dad about how she needed to push through the pain without complaining. Georgette leaned in close and whispered that she'd been keeping these papers for years, waiting for the right moment to use them. She said she thought that moment was coming now, whether we were ready for it or not. Her eyes looked scared but also determined, like she'd finally decided to stop protecting Dad and start protecting me instead. I took the folder and hid it in my backpack, and Georgette squeezed my hand once before walking away. Later that week, Paul cornered me by the bathroom and told me something that made my stomach turn. He said Dad's men's group had been comparing their family's height ratios at their weekly meetings, and apparently Dad had been bragging about how he was fixing me before I became a permanent embarrassment to the family. Paul said it like he was proud to be part of this system, and like he thought I should be grateful Dad was putting in so much effort to correct me. He mentioned that other men in the group had daughters they were working on too, and they all shared tips about compression techniques and which doctors would do the surgeries. I felt sick thinking about how many other girls in our community were going through the same thing I was, and how their fathers all got together to congratulate each other about it. Paul walked away looking pleased with himself, and I realized he genuinely believed this was all normal and right. I decided I needed to record what actually happened at these meetings, so people would believe me about the community aspect. The following week, I waited until Dad left for his men's group, and then I followed him in the dark, staying far enough back that he wouldn't notice. He drove to a house about 15 minutes away, and I watched him go inside with 5 other men I recognized from church. I crept around to the side of the house where I could see through a window into the room where they were meeting. I pulled out my phone and started recording the audio through the window. The men sat in a circle praising each other for keeping their women in proper proportion, and they shared specific tips about compression techniques that had worked for their families. One man talked about his daughter's growth plate surgery like it was this huge achievement, and he showed photos of her before and after measurements. Another man mentioned a girl from the community who had run away last year and brought shame on her whole family, and they all agreed that running away had to be prevented at any cost. They talked about monitoring their daughter's activities and limiting their contact with people outside the community who might put wrong ideas in their heads. Dad contributed to the conversation by describing my situation and how the compression wasn't working fast enough, so he'd scheduled the surgery. The other men nodded approvingly, and one of them said Dad was doing the right thing by taking decisive action. I recorded about 20 minutes before I got too scared someone would see me, and I ran back to where I'd hidden my bike. A few days later, Mom tried to take Charlie to a pediatric follow-up appointment to get more information about managing his dwarfism. She had the appointment card in her hand, and Charlie strapped in his car seat, and she was backing out of the driveway when Dad's truck suddenly blocked her in. He got out and walked over to her window and demanded to know where she thought she was going. Mom showed him the appointment card and said the pediatrician wanted to check on Charlie's development, but Dad grabbed the card right out of her hand and ripped it into pieces. He said Charlie's genetics were God's plan and didn't need medical interference from doctors who would try to make it into some kind of problem that needed fixing. Mom started crying and Dad told her to take Charlie back inside and cancel any future appointments. I watched from the window and realized Dad was going to control Charlie's medical care the same way he'd controlled everything else about our bodies. He wasn't going to let any doctor tell him that Charlie's height was anything other than exactly what God intended. I couldn't keep this inside anymore, so I went back to Carmen's office during lunch the next day. This time when she asked how I was doing, I told her absolutely everything. I told her about the weighted backpack and the hours I had to wear it, and how my back felt like it was breaking. I told her about the door frame pulls where Dad literally hung me up and pulled down on my legs. I told her about the surgery that was scheduled and how Dominic wasn't even a real doctor. I showed her the recordings I'd made of Dad's men's group and the photos of the ledger and the backpack. I pulled up the files on the school computer and let her see everything I'd been documenting. Carmen listened without interrupting, and her face got more and more serious as I talked. When I finished, she helped me create what she called a safety plan for if things got worse at home. She gave me emergency numbers to call, and she said she was filing a formal report that day, because what was happening to me met the legal definition of child abuse. She said the evidence I'd collected was important, and that I'd done the right thing by documenting everything. For the first time, I felt like maybe someone with actual power was going to do something to help me. That evening, I was in my room when Dad came in holding my old phone that I thought I'd hidden so carefully. His face was red and the veins in his neck were standing out and he was shaking with anger. He'd found the phone and discovered the cloud storage account with all my evidence and he was absolutely losing it. He smashed the phone against my desk so hard that pieces of it flew across the room and he started screaming that I was trying to destroy the family. He said I was a traitor and a liar and that I was making up stories to turn people against him. He told me I wasn't going to the school anymore until after the surgery, and that he'd pull me out permanently if I ever spoke to Carmen or anyone else about family business again. He said the surgery was happening in 2 days now instead of next week, because he wasn't giving me any more time to cause trouble. Mom stood in the doorway looking terrified, but she didn't say anything to stop him. Dad took my school laptop and my regular phone and said I was grounded to my room except for meals and bathroom breaks. He put a lock on the outside of my door and said this was for my own good, until I learned to be loyal to my family. The next morning, I didn't show up at the school because Dad had locked me in my room. Carmen noticed I was absent and she called Alyssa and they coordinated an unannounced joint visit to check on my welfare. They showed up at our house with a police officer who said they had the legal right to enter and check that I was safe. Dad tried to turn them away at the front door, and he put on his charming voice saying everything was fine and I was just homesick today. But the officer said they needed to see me in person, and that refusing entry would make things worse. I heard their footsteps coming through the house and Carmen calling my name, and then I heard them discover the lock on the outside of my bedroom door. The officer told Dad to open it immediately, and Dad had no choice but to unlock it with everyone standing right there watching him. The door swung open and Carmen stepped into my room first, her eyes scanning everything with this focused look that made me feel like someone was finally seeing what I'd been living with. Alyssa came in right behind her and pulled out her phone to start taking pictures, and I watched her photograph the wooden board where my mattress used to be, and the way my bed frame sat empty and hard. Carmen knelt down next to where I was sitting on the floor and asked if I was okay, and I nodded even though my whole body was shaking. Because I didn't know if this was finally help arriving, or if Dad was going to find a way to make them leave and then punish me worse than ever. Alyssa moved to the doorframe and photographed the metal rig that was still attached there with the straps hanging down, and she asked Dad what it was for in this calm, professional voice. Dad stood in the hallway with his arms crossed and said it was therapeutic equipment for my posture because I'd been complaining about back pain. He said the board was better for spinal alignment than a soft mattress, and the doorframe setup was for stretching exercises recommended by our family doctor. The police officer asked which doctor and Dad gave some name I'd never heard before, and I could see Alyssa writing everything down in her notepad. Carmen asked me quietly if I wanted to tell them what the equipment was really used for, and I looked at Dad standing there watching me, and I felt my throat close up with fear. But then I thought about Georgette's limp and the surgery that was supposed to happen in 2 days, and I made myself speak. I told them about the weighted backpack and the hours of compression and the doorframe poles where Dad would hang me up and literally pull down on my legs. Alyssa asked where the backpack was now, and I said Dad kept it in the garage, so the officer went with Dad to look for it while Alyssa stayed with me and Carmen. They found it exactly where I said it would be with my name written on it in marker, and Alyssa photographed it from every angle including the worn straps that had left marks on my shoulders. When they came back inside, Dad's whole attitude shifted into this charming mode where he smiled at Alyssa and Carmen and said I'd been making up stories for attention lately. He said the equipment was all stuff I'd asked for because I was insecure about being tall, and I wanted to look shorter, and he was just trying to help me feel better about myself. He pulled out his phone and showed them photos of me smiling at family events and birthday parties, and he said I had a history of self-harm and blaming other people for my problems. I sat there listening to him perform this version of reality that sounded almost believable if you didn't look too close at the evidence, and I felt sick watching how easily he could twist everything. Carmen asked me directly if what Dad was saying was true, and I shook my head and said he made me wear the backpack as punishment for growing taller than Paul. Dad's smile got tighter, and he said I was proving his point about making up stories, and he told Alyssa that he'd be happy to provide documentation from our family doctor about my mental health concerns. The officer asked if I had any visible injuries, and Carmen pointed to the strap marks on my shoulders that were still visible, and Alyssa took more photos while Dad claimed those were from my school backpack. They stayed for another hour going through the house and documenting everything, and when they finally left, Dad stood in the doorway watching their car drive away with this expression that made my blood run cold. 3 days later, Dr. Achin sent a formal report to CPS describing the pattern of injuries she'd documented at the emergency room visit. She wrote that the compression trauma was consistent with prolonged external force, rather than natural growing pains, and she included the X-ray findings showing early disc changes in my spine that weren't normal for someone my age. The report stated that the injuries indicated ongoing inflicted harm rather than accidental or self-inflicted damage, and she recommended immediate intervention to prevent permanent physical damage. Alyssa called our house the day after she received the report and said she was opening an official dependency case, and she scheduled a meeting with Mom and Dad to go over the interim safety plan. The meeting happened at our kitchen table with Alyssa sitting across from my parents and me sitting at the end trying to make myself invisible. Alyssa explained that a court date had been set for 2 weeks out, and until then there were strict rules Dad had to follow. She pulled out a printed document that said, Dad couldn't use any restraints or exercise equipment on me, and he couldn't prevent me from going to the school or seeing the counselor. Dad signed the plan with this tight smile that didn't reach his eyes, and he nodded along while Alyssa explained the consequences of violating the agreement. The second Alyssa's car pulled out of the driveway, Dad turned to me and said that paper agreements don't change what happens in this house. He said I'd made a huge mistake involving outsiders in family business, and I was going to learn what loyalty really means. Mom sat at the table staring at her hands and didn't say anything to stop him, and I felt this crushing weight knowing that even with official protection, I was still trapped. That evening, I went to my school laptop and pulled up all the photos I'd taken at Dominic's clinic, and I attached them to an email to Alyssa with a subject line that said, information about the doctor. I included the pictures of his weird diplomas, and the bone charts on his walls and the paperwork I'd photographed on his desk, and I wrote that I didn't think he was a real doctor based on what I'd seen. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, and then I sat there feeling this small sense of power, knowing I might be able to stop him from hurting other girls the way he'd hurt Georgette. Alyssa responded the next morning saying she was forwarding everything to the state licensing board for investigation, and she said they would look into whether he was legally allowed to perform the surgeries he'd been doing. She thanked me for being brave enough to document everything, and said the evidence I'd collected was helping build a strong case. I saved her email and read it 3 times because it felt like proof that someone with actual authority was finally taking this seriously. That night after Dad fell asleep, Georgette crept into my room and sat on the edge of my wooden board. She was crying before she even started talking, and she told me about the years since her surgery, and how the chronic pain never went away no matter what she tried. She described how her altered gait throws off her whole body so her hips hurt, and her knees hurt, and her back hurts all the time, and how she has to plan her whole day around managing the pain. She said she can't run anymore, and she can't stand for long periods, and she has to be careful about every movement she makes. She pulled up her pant legs and showed me the keloid scars that were raised and angry-looking even 3 years after the surgery, and she said some of them still get infected sometimes. She told me Dad praised her afterward for making the sacrifice, and told everyone in his group what a good daughter she was, and she said she let them do this to her because she thought it would make Dad love her. She was sobbing by the end, and I put my arms around her even though my back was killing me, and we sat there together knowing that the system that destroyed her body was trying to do the same thing to mine. The next day, Alyssa came back to talk to Mom privately about testifying at the court hearing. I listened from the hallway as Alyssa explained that Mom's statement would be important evidence about what had been happening in the house. Mom's voice was shaking when she said she couldn't testify or make any statement, and she told Alyssa she was afraid that if she angered Dad, she would lose all her children instead of just protecting one. She said she was trapped between her fear of him and her love for us, and she didn't know how to choose. Alyssa tried to explain that the court could protect her, but Mom just kept saying she couldn't risk it. I stood there feeling this complicated mix of resentment and pity, because I understood she was scared, but I also needed her to be brave enough to help me. After Alyssa left, Mom found me in my room and said she was sorry, but she had to think about all her kids, not just me, and I didn't say anything because what was there to say? 2 days later, I waited until Dad went in the shower and then I grabbed his phone from the kitchen counter. My hands were shaking as I opened his messages and found the group chat with his men's group, and I started scrolling through months of conversations. The messages were full of them bragging about correcting their daughters and sharing techniques for compression and growth suppression. I found messages where Dad promised to send before and after measurements from my surgery, and other men responding with praise and encouragement. There were messages about girls who'd successfully been compressed, and celebrations when families maintained proper height ratios. There were also messages shaming families where girls were taller than their brothers, and talking about those families as failures. I screenshotted everything as fast as I could, sending the images to my email account before clearing the notification history so Dad wouldn't know I'd been in his phone. I saved everything in a folder labeled evidence, and felt like I was finally building a case that no one could deny. That same week, I noticed Paul getting moody and ashamed whenever Dad measured him. The protein regimen was making him gain weight, but not height, and he was still stuck at 5'7" while getting thicker around the middle. Dad would look disappointed during measurements, and Paul would storm off to his room afterward. I caught him looking at me one afternoon with this complicated expression that might have been jealousy or pity or both. I realized the system that was crushing me was also crushing him in different ways, and even though he'd been awful to me, I felt a tiny bit of sympathy for him. He was trapped in Dad's expectations too, just from a different angle, and neither of us could ever measure up to what Dad wanted us to be. Meanwhile, Carmen was drafting a detailed letter for the court describing every injury she'd observed since I first came to her office. She included notes from every conversation we'd had and documented the changes in my physical presentation over the past months. She wrote about how I'd gone from walking normally to constant slouching, from participating in class to barely being able to sit upright, from being engaged to being withdrawn and scared. Her professional assessment stated that I was at risk of serious harm if I remained in the home without intervention, and she recommended immediate protective action. She submitted the letter along with notes from the school nurse about my declining physical condition and the multiple times I'd been sent to the nurse's office for back pain. The letter was 8 pages long, and it laid out everything in clear professional language that made it impossible to dismiss what was happening to me as normal parenting or family discipline. The court hearing happened 3 weeks later, and the judge issued an interim order that said I could stay at home as long as Dad followed strict conditions about no restraints or compression equipment. Dad signed the paperwork right there in the courtroom and told the judge he understood completely and would comply with everything. Alyssa scheduled follow-up visits to check on the conditions, and Dad spent the days before her first visit making the house look perfect. He hid the weighted backpack in the garage attic and stored the door frame equipment in Paul's closet where no one would think to look. When Alyssa came by for her inspection, Dad walked her through every room with this calm, helpful attitude and answered all her questions about my daily routine. She asked to see my bedroom, and Dad showed her the regular mattress he'd put back on my bed frame and pointed out how I had privacy and space. She asked me how things were going, and I could feel Dad watching from the doorway, so I said everything was fine and my back was feeling better. Alyssa wrote notes on her clipboard and said the home environment looked appropriate and she'd check back in 2 weeks. The second she left, Dad went straight to my room and started unscrewing my bedroom door from its hinges. He carried the door down to the basement and told me privacy was a privilege I hadn't earned, and he needed to make sure I was following proper posture guidelines even when no one was watching. That first night without the door, I lay on my bed trying to sleep and kept hearing Dad's footsteps in the hallway. Around 2 in the morning, he came into my room and turned on the light and told me to stand up. He measured my posture against the wall with a level and said my spine wasn't straight enough, so I had to stand there for an hour to correct it. I stood against that wall so tired I could barely keep my eyes open, and when I started to slouch forward, he added another 30 minutes. This happened every single night for the next 2 weeks, and I was so exhausted at the school I couldn't focus on anything. My teachers noticed I was falling asleep in class, but I told them I just wasn't sleeping well, and they suggested I talk to the school nurse about it. 2 weeks after the door came off, I was in gym class trying to play volleyball when my back went into this massive spasm that dropped me straight to the floor. The pain was so intense I couldn't breathe, and the gym teacher ran over asking what happened. She called the school nurse, who took one look at me and called an ambulance because I couldn't stand up or straighten out. The paramedics came and lifted me onto a stretcher, and I heard them radioing the hospital about a 13-year-old with severe back spasms. At the emergency room, they admitted me for pain management because my back had gone into constant spasm and wouldn't release. The nurses gave me medication and asked questions about my medical history, and when they mentioned calling my parents, I felt this wave of panic that must have shown on my face. One of the nurses wrote something in my chart, and then she came back and sat next to my bed and asked very gently if I felt safe at home. I didn't know what to say, so I just stared at the ceiling, and she patted my hand and said she was noting my anxiety response to family contact in my medical record. Dr. Chin came to see me the next morning and ordered a full radiology workup, including x-rays and an MRI of my spine. The radiologist spent a long time looking at the images and then called Dr. Chin back to review them together. They found changes to my vertebral discs that were abnormal for a 13-year-old, and the radiologist noted that the pattern suggested chronic external compression rather than natural development. Dr. Chin came back to my room and explained that the damage to my spine was consistent with prolonged mechanical pressure, and that this evidence was strong enough to support emergency action. She said she was documenting everything in my medical record with specific language about suspected abuse, and that she'd be sending her findings to CPS immediately. Alyssa got the medical reports that afternoon and filed a petition for emergency removal based on the new findings and the evidence that the interim safety plan wasn't protecting me. She argued that I was at imminent risk of permanent physical damage if I stayed in the home, and she attached Dr. Chin's reports, Carmen's observations, and the photos of Dominic's unlicensed clinic that I'd taken months ago. A judge reviewed the petition within 24 hours and approved the emergency removal. Alyssa picked me up from the hospital with 2 police officers as escort and drove me across town to a temporary foster home where Dad didn't know the address. The foster parents were this older couple who showed me to a small bedroom with an actual door and a soft mattress and told me I could rest as much as I needed. I sat on the bed and felt this overwhelming mix of relief that I was finally safe and guilt that I was leaving Georgette and Paul and Charlie behind in that house. I cried for the first time in weeks because I didn't have to hold everything together anymore, and because I knew my siblings were still trapped in the same system that had almost broken me. The next day, Mom's number showed up on the foster home phone, and when I answered, I heard Dad's voice instead. He said I was a traitor who was destroying the family, and that when I came back, he'd make sure I understood what loyalty really meant. His voice had this cold edge that made my hands shake, and I hung up without saying anything. The foster mom called Alyssa right away, and Alyssa documented the call as a violation of the no-contact order and warned Mom that any more third-party contact would result in consequences. I felt scared all over again knowing Dad was still trying to control me even from a distance, and that he'd found a way around the court order within 24 hours. 3 days later, Alyssa took me to a physical therapy clinic near the foster home and introduced me to a therapist who specialized in treating kids with chronic pain. The therapist had me do these gentle exercises that were supposed to reduce pain without causing more injury, and she showed me how to stand and sit without automatically slouching forward. She explained that my body had learned to protect itself through bad posture, but that now I could slowly retrain it to move normally without expecting punishment. The exercises hurt at first, but in a different way than the compression equipment, and after a few sessions, I noticed I could stand up straighter without my back screaming at me. 2 weeks into my foster placement, Georgette came to visit under CPS supervision, and she brought a manila envelope stuffed with papers. We sat in the foster home living room with a CPS supervisor watching from across the room, and Georgette pulled out more pages from the height ledger that went back before I was even born. The pages showed measurements of our aunts and female cousins with dates going back 20 years, and there were notes in Dad's handwriting about which girls needed correction and which families maintained proper order. One page had a list of girls who'd had surgery with Dominic and notes about their recovery times and final heights. I realized this had been going on for generations and that Dad's system wasn't just about our family, but about an entire network of families doing the same thing to their daughters. Georgette's hands were shaking when she showed me a page about our grandmother who'd broken her own legs and how Dad had written that she understood true sacrifice. That same week, Alyssa called to tell me the state licensing board had investigated Dominic and discovered he was operating without proper medical credentials. His diplomas were from unaccredited schools, and he'd never completed a legitimate surgical residency. He shut down his home clinic before they could complete the full investigation and move to another state. Alyssa said he wouldn't be able to hurt any more girls through surgery, at least not in our state. And I felt this cautious satisfaction knowing I'd helped stop him, even though he'd probably never face real consequences for what he'd done to Georgette and all the other girls. Alyssa called me 3 weeks later to tell me that Mom had taken Charlie to a pediatric appointment without telling Dad, which was the first time I'd heard about Mom doing anything that went against his control. The doctor gave Mom information about managing dwarfism and connecting with support groups for families, and Mom hid all the paperwork in her car under the spare tire where Dad wouldn't think to look. Alyssa said Mom had been reading the materials during her lunch breaks at work and asking the pediatrician questions about Charlie's development, and I felt this weird mix of hope and worry, because Mom taking action meant things might change, but it also meant Dad would find out eventually. 2 days after that appointment, Dad discovered the paperwork when he was looking for jumper cables in Mom's trunk, and he confronted her in the driveway while she was getting groceries out of the car. Alyssa heard about it from a neighbor who called CPS after watching Dad block Mom against the car and yell at her for 20 minutes about medicalizing Charlie's condition. Dad told Mom that Charlie's height was natural and perfect the way God made him, but Alyssa said the neighbor could hear him screaming about Mom acting without permission and losing control over the family. The neighbor recorded part of it on her phone and sent it to CPS, and you could hear Dad saying that no doctor was going to turn his son into a medical experiment. 4 weeks after my removal, the dependency hearing finally happened at the county courthouse, and I sat in the waiting area with Alyssa, while Carmen went in first to testify about her observations at the school. The judge granted a no-contact order between me and Dad, while allowing supervised visits with my siblings, and when I walked past the courtroom door, I could see Dad sitting there looking calm and reasonable in a button-down shirt. But I watched his face when the judge said he couldn't have any contact with me until he completed parenting classes and anger management, and I saw the rage underneath his composed expression when he clenched his jaw so hard I thought his teeth would crack. After the hearing, the community men started pressuring Mom to bring me back home and drop the case, and Paul cornered me in the school hallway 2 days later to repeat their threats about family shame and consequences for betrayal. He said the men were talking about how our family was being torn apart by outside interference, and how I was responsible for bringing government agents into private family matters. Mom called me that night crying and saying the pressure was too much, and I realized that even with court orders in place, the community's power was still crushing her because they controlled her social world and her sense of identity. Carmen helped me write a statement for the court the following week, and she kept telling me to stay factual and specific about what happened without adding emotion or exaggerating anything. I described the weighted backpack and how long I had to wear it each day, the doorframe pulls, and how Dad would yank down on my legs, the wooden board that replaced my mattress, the scheduled surgery with Dominic, and the recordings I'd made of Dad's men's group meetings. Carmen read through my statement twice and said it was powerful because it was simple and truthful, and she helped me organize it so the judge could follow the timeline of everything that happened. 3 weeks after I submitted my statement, Mom called me late at night in tears, and she was whispering into the phone saying that Dad had tried to strap small weights near Charlie's bassinet, claiming they were for proper spinal alignment. She said she was terrified he was going to do to Charlie what he'd done to Georgette and me, and I could hear her voice shaking like she was afraid Dad would hear her making the call. She kept saying she finally understood that Dad's control didn't have any limits, that he would hurt even a baby to maintain his system. I hung up with Mom and immediately called Alyssa even though it was almost midnight, and I told her exactly what Mom had said about the weights and Charlie's bassinet. Alyssa said she was dispatching a wellness check to the house right away, and she stayed on the phone with me while she called it in, and Carmen logged a note documenting my report. The police arrived at the house within an hour, and they found Dad standing over Charlie's crib with compression wraps in his hands, while Mom was crying in the corner, unable to stop him. The officers took photos of everything and called CPS, and by morning Charlie was in emergency protective custody. CPS removed Charlie temporarily and placed him in a different foster home than me, because they wanted to avoid sibling placement complications, and Mom agreed to a supervision plan that let her keep custody of Paul if she followed all the services and stayed separated from Dad. I worried about Charlie even though I knew he was safer away from Dad, and I kept thinking about how small he was and whether his foster parents understood about his dwarfism. Mom had to move into her sister's house to maintain the separation requirement, and Paul stayed with her under CPS monitoring. The police questioned Dad about the compression wraps and his intentions with Charlie, and they arrested him on charges of child endangerment and obstruction of a court order since the dependency case was still active. He got released on bail the same day, and he went straight back to the community where the men rallied around him and started talking about government overreach and religious persecution. I heard from Georgette that they were organizing some kind of support campaign and claiming that CPS was targeting families for their traditional beliefs. The main court hearing happened 3 weeks later, and I had to testify in person about everything that happened while Dad sat at a table with his lawyer staring at me. Carmen testified before me and presented her timeline of observations, and Dr. Chin came after to give her professional opinions about the medical evidence and the pattern of injuries. Georgette submitted a written statement describing her own surgery and its long-term effects, and she included photos of her scars and medical records showing the complications she still dealt with years later. The judge listened to everything without showing much emotion, just taking notes and occasionally asking questions about specific dates or details. I watched Dad's face during my testimony and saw him trying to look confused and hurt, like he couldn't understand why I was saying these things about him. When Carmen described finding me collapsed at the school, his lawyer objected and said it was speculation, but the judge overruled it and let her continue. Dr. Chin's testimony about the spinal compression and the doorframe injuries seemed to hit hardest because she had the x-rays and photos to back up everything she said, and the judge spent a long time looking at those images. After everyone finished testifying, the judge said she needed time to review all the evidence and make her ruling, and she scheduled another hearing for 2 weeks out to announce her decision. Those 2 weeks felt like forever, because I kept thinking Dad would find some way to stop the ruling or make the judge change her mind. When the hearing date finally came, I sat in the same courtroom with Carmen next to me and Dad at his table with his lawyer looking calm and confident. The judge came in and everyone stood up, and then she started reading her orders in this flat voice that made everything sound official and final. She said Dad was barred from any contact with me and Charlie until he completed parenting classes and anger management and passed a psychological evaluation. She said Mom had to do parenting classes and therapy before she could have unsupervised time with us, and that Paul could stay with Mom, but CPS would be monitoring the home. She said the case would stay open for at least a year to make sure everyone followed the plan and that there would be regular check-ins and reviews. I felt this huge wave of relief wash through my whole body because it meant Dad couldn't touch me or Charlie anymore. But I also felt really sad that it took all of this to get protection. Dad's face went red when the judge said he couldn't contact us, and his lawyer had to put a hand on his arm to keep him from saying something. Mom just sat there crying quietly and nodding when the judge talked to her directly about the requirements. After the hearing ended, Carmen walked me out to Alyssa's car, and I moved into my foster placement that same afternoon. The foster parents had set up a bedroom for me with a real mattress and curtains and a desk, and they seemed nice, but I kept waiting for them to show their real intentions. I started going to physical therapy twice a week at a clinic near the foster home, and the therapist showed me exercises to strengthen my back and stretch out the compressed areas. She had me practice standing up straight in front of a mirror, and at first it felt completely wrong, like I was making myself too visible and too tall. But slowly over the next few weeks, my back started hurting less, and I noticed I wasn't automatically slouching when people looked at me anymore. My foster parents would make dinner every night and ask if I wanted seconds, and I'd watch them carefully for signs that they wanted something from me. I was learning that trust wasn't something that just came back automatically, even when people were being kind. One night, my phone buzzed with a text from Georgette asking how I was doing with standing up straight. I I texted back that I was learning to walk without hunching, and that it felt weird but good. She sent me a photo of herself standing tall in front of a mirror, and said she was thinking about getting a second opinion on her surgical complications. We texted back and forth about how the fear of being too tall doesn't just disappear because we're safe now, and how we both still catch ourselves slouching sometimes. She said she'd been living with the pain and the limp for so long that she forgot it wasn't normal, and I told her I was starting to remember what it felt like to stand without my spine screaming. We both knew we were going to carry this with us forever, but at least we were carrying it together, and at least we could text each other when the fear got too loud. Well, there it is. Another top-tier display of questionable decision-making. If you made it to the end, you deserve an award, or therapy. Either way, you're already here, so you might as well subscribe. Let's keep the chaos consistent.